Welcome back to our Faith Forward platform. I'm Jon Ackerman. With me, as always, Brian Bales.
You know, sometimes when you do that and you put your hand over here, I think I'm supposed to say my name and I get thrown off. So I don't know if I'm supposed to or not.
Or it's like
so
a high five.
That is my name. Hey, there you go. Welcome. Sorry. Welcome back.
Welcome back. So if you've been with us for the last few weeks, on Sundays we're in the midst of this series, this message series, Jesus 24/7. Mm-hmm. My wife was really on board with Jesus Has Left the Building, and we just couldn't get anybody to dress up as Elvis. So Jesus 24/7 with us every day. And we've really been trying to hone in on, not only in the Sunday message, but especially here on this podcast platform, the practicality of Jesus with us every day. And so this Sunday, Pastor Mike Haynes had a message. Pastor Chris laid some of the foundation for it last week about Jesus and the 5,000, which is a story that many of us know if we've been around church for a while. And much like Mike is not going to focus a whole lot on the miracle itself, we're not either. Yeah. We still want to provide some context for it. So
well, there's a little bit of a connection, or actually a lot of connection between what Pastor Chris did 2 Sundays ago and then what Mike does this week, and we're focusing a lot on these I am statements in the Gospel of John, but actually we're not in the Gospel of John this week, which is a little bit of a, catching people off guard. But it is this idea of bringing the idea behind what Chris was bringing to the forefront a little bit farther. And it's something that I think all of us really need to hear when we think about the 24/7 Jesus that's in us. So a couple of weeks ago, Chris reminded us that, when it says that I'm the bread of life, that Jesus is our source. What does it mean that we live from that? And he used some of the stuff from the feeding of the 5,000. And again, Mike led into that today and kind of stopped in an interesting place. So we do encourage you to listen to both of those talks. They did both a great job. But here's a quick context of it. People wanted something from Jesus all the time. And in this one particular point, Jesus had fed 5,000 people. It just did an amazing miracle. Now, the interesting thing is that when you back up before that moment where he does that, there's a lot of tension going on. Number one, there's probably more than 5,000 people because it's just 5,000 men. So if they all brought their spouses and a kid, 15,000 or more, no problem saying there's way more than 5,000 people. Yeah. And they all show up and they're out in the middle of nowhere and it's dinner time and they've been out there a long time. Jesus was really doing a fairly long sermon. And there's this moment where everyone's hungry and they have to eat. And so the disciples bring this up. And this is the tension Mike was hitting up, that all these people are out there have come to listen to you teach. They need to eat. And so let's send them away, right? Let's have them go to their homes or whatever it might be. And Jesus doesn't give them the response, right? He says to this, hey, you feed them. Now, let's just take that and put that in today's context.
Sure.
Because it's not any less overwhelming today than it was then. Imagine there's 12 of you, and I was just talking about this with John previously. 12 of you, maybe only 11 of you committed to this idea of following Jesus. We think about Judas. And he says, all right, now there's over 5,000 people here. Go make them lunch. Can you imagine rolling up to Chick-fil-A, no matter how good they are, and saying, hey, I need 5,000 at minimum Chick-fil-A sandwiches. I'm not even talking about fries or drinks. Just 5,000 Chick-fil-A sandwiches, and I need them in under an hour. It's just not possible. It's not there. And so now we got to feel this tension in a culture that, couldn't just grab bread at the grocery store, that couldn't just all of a sudden go to their fridge and pull out all the stuff that they had ready to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or whatever it may be, that Jesus looks at the disciples out in the middle of kind of nowhere, not in a city where there's a lot to grasp, but even if they were in a city where there's a lot to grasp, it's not the way we would do it, right? There's no Wegmans there. There's nothing of that nature. But even if you think about Wegmans, imagine 12 people going to shop at Wegmans for enough food for 5,000 people. It is completely overwhelming. Yet Jesus looks at them, and this is the tension Mike spoke into that we'll talk about today, and says when they bring this problem, he looks at them and says, you feed them.
Yeah. And so the practical application here is, one, just beginning to allow for our heart, our mind, our memory to bring up those times where it's felt like God has dropped a God-sized problem in our lap and said, you do it. And I think if we're being honest, we've probably all felt moments like that.
Yeah.
Of, God, I feel like this is your department, and I feel like I'm being asked to do something that I'm just not capable of. And one of the things that Mike got into in the message and that we want to dig into a little bit deeper here is that's actually not what God did in that moment. That wasn't what Jesus actually asked the disciples to do in that moment. He didn't actually ask them to go to Chick-fil-A or Wegmans or wherever and physically do this themselves. but it was an invitation into this process instead of just passively waiting for Jesus to do everything or expecting the disciples to do everything. It was an invitation into with.
Yeah, and I think you're bringing out something that we'll continue to flesh out, that we tend to be people, whether we recognize it or not, that live in sort of this either or instead of both and tension when it comes to God. Either I have to do it all myself, or God, you have to do it all yourself. But actually, it's more we do this together. And we think of we're talking about the 24/7 Jesus Spirit that is in us. Everywhere we go, there is a we, right? There's that aspect of it. And so he's really hitting at that tension. I think that a lot of us, whether we're the actual disciples in this story or not, really approach our interaction, our relationship with God through this either or. Either I do it because the problem that seems to be dropped in my lap, or in my case, I created, I feel I can handle on my own, so God don't have to bother you. Or I feel like I can't handle it on my own, so I'm just going to come give this back to you, God, and you handle this while I'm going to do my other stuff. Right? And I thought Mike did a really good job of making us feel that sort of tension. In fact, I remember just hearing it at first when I was reading where he was going, and we've talked about this before, that we get a little bit of a heads up, whether it's me preaching or Chris or Mike, about where we're going. We kind of process it for our time together to have a discussion here on this platform. And I remember reading what he said at first and kind of feeling some tension, like, where is he going with this? And I appreciated the tension that he was drawing out, because I think that's how it works a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And so again, step one is just being honest and being aware of those moments where we feel like we're supposed to do it because God expects us to do it on our own, which right there is an invitation to shift the perspective from God expects me to do this on my own to God is inviting me to do something with him. Yeah,
because if he was inviting us to his own, why would he give us the Spirit all the time?
Right.
I mean, that's one of the things when we look at when Jesus talks about giving his Spirit to us, it's to guide us, to comfort us, to empower us, to help us. There's so many things that's there. Never has this been innocent bystander just watching you as like, maybe even a good fan, right? I mean, because God's a big fan of his children, but he's actually out there on the field with us, not just on the side sitting in the chair with the umbrella keeping the sun off or the wind off or the rain off or whatever it may be, going, hey, great job. He's there helping us.
Yeah. And so God's inviting, Jesus in this moment is inviting the disciples to do things with. Broader application for us, God is inviting us to do things with. And so often we think about it as, I'm either supposed to do it without him or he's supposed to do it without me, which is the other piece. And you're right. So very binary on this, either or. But then Mike got into another point where, and again, talk about tension and just a moment of self-analysis, that so often when we try to do things, we do things that hopefully then allow others to ask less of us. Right? If I do something really well, then nobody should have to ask me for help. If I do something, really well, then I shouldn't have to do it again. If I do something really well, then I won't have to ask somebody else to come help me, right? And yet the contrast here is Jesus inviting people to do things in a way that actually then requires Jesus or God the Father or the whole to engage even more.
Yeah. There is this tension. I like to use this analogy. There's a belief, for example, for a lot of people who may have children in their home. And it goes like this, that my job as a parent is to create kids who are independent. Because if you think about it, right, when they're young, when that sort of stuff, there's so much you have to do for them. But obviously, if you're still doing the same things for them when they're 14 or 15 that you were doing for them when they're 4 and they're 5, there's some problems there, right? So you do want your kids to grow. You do want them to be able to do more on their own. And so there's this belief, what I'm trying to do is create kids that are independent. Fundamentally, as believers, as anyone who's been blessed with the stewardship of another human being that's younger than them, whether it's an actual kid or whether you work as a spiritual father or a spiritual mother or whatever, it actually isn't to make them independent. It's actually to move them from dependent upon that spiritual father and mother or that biological father and mother to dependence upon God, right? We're moving them from parent or influential dependent of that person to God dependent. And how that sneaks into our relationship when we talk about God our Father is this idea that you just talked about, that we do most everything to make people less connected or dependent upon us. God does everything to make us understand and live from that 24/7 spirit that he's given us to be more dependent upon him. Because in every other place of life, John, if you think about it, every other place, if we become more dependent, we feel like that's a failure.
Absolutely.
Like if I said to you, hey, tomorrow you're going to be more dependent upon me as your friend than you are, the day before. You kind of think, ooh, maybe I'm not doing something right? And I get that, but I mean, if you say, okay, well, tomorrow, but then it's a month from now or 2 months, like, why aren't you learning this yourself? Like we always talk about your house, and you just did some work on your house. If I came over and you were showing me how to do things, I would be grateful. But if I was becoming more dependent upon how to roof a house on you every day, you'd be like, something's not working, something's wrong. But that is not the model that Jesus is laying out. So I think it is something that we really have to get in our thoughts. And, we want to challenge our thinking. We want to move our faith forward. And sometimes to move our faith forward, we have to really identify something that we believe intrinsically, or we believe without even processing or critiquing it, that might seem good, but it's not right.
Yep.
And it's not right in this scenario.
Yeah. And, I am certainly one of those people that has an incredibly difficult time asking for help.
Yeah.
And so I've wanted to be fiercely independent pretty much my whole life. I mean, I started asking to learn how to do the laundry, I think when I was 6 or 7, because I just wanted to be able to do my laundry and not have to deal with everybody else's laundry, which is probably a metaphor for life in some ways.
Well, it's also, I'd like to bring you to my house and teach my kids that same thought sometimes.
But, to your point about, asking for help and, needing somebody to teach you things, and especially working on my house, one of the perspective shifts that I've had just recently was, my dad's taught me a lot about how to use tools and, how to build things and things like that. And I think always in the back of my head, there was this notion of I am moving towards independence.
Yeah.
Right. So he used to have to, hold my hand to show me how to use a hammer and hold my hand to show me how to use a power drill. And there was always, it felt like this assumption that someday you're going to be able to do this on your own.
Yeah.
And there's a part of that that's true. But I think what I failed to grasp all this time, and I'm only now coming to grips with as my dad is helping me to work on my house, is the more that he's shown me how to do, the more that I'm actually able to do with him in a way that I couldn't. Back when he had to hold my hand to do the hammering, there was a level of width that we weren't able to do that I am now able to do with him because of the development of my skills. And I've realized how much like God this is. There are invitations to grow in our relationship with God, and there's invitations to grow in our understanding of how God's world works.
Yeah.
To grow in prayer, to grow in the disciplines that we talk about in our Rooted program or just on Sundays. But it's never so that we don't need God. It's actually so that we can do even more with God. But that there's a capacity and a capability that we have developed. And the more we develop, again, like with my house, I'm able to do projects with my dad now that I couldn't have dreamed of doing years ago because I wasn't ready. He had the capacity, he had the capability. And so as I've grown up into it, what we're able to do together has increased exponentially.
Yeah. As you keep talking, there's a thought that keeps running back to my mind that isn't necessarily in these notes, that some of people who might be hearing this like this idea in theory, but they're kind of struggling with the idea that God would want to do something with them.
Sure.
That's really an identity question that we talk about a lot of times. And so just sort of, undergirding all of what we're saying here is an assumption of truth that is actually true, that God wants to be with us. Right? And for some of us, because we've gotten some wrong beliefs in our head and that sort of stuff, we're like, oh, well, maybe he really didn't want to be with us. To which we go back, if God didn't really want to be with us, he would not have placed his spirit in us. Right? He could have, and catch this, he could have controlled, because some people think that his spirit's just in us to control our behavior.
Sure.
Like he's this really big cosmic babysitter. Right? And don't get me wrong, he initiates and guides our behavior, but that is just a part of something bigger. So if you're struggling with what John just said about like, I didn't have a physical dad that actually did that, so I can't relate to that. And why would God actually ever want that? I really want you to think about this idea that he could have accomplished just if he's just going to manage your behavior a whole different lots of ways. But instead, he put his spirit in us to be with us. And being with us means so much more than what we think about many times.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's what we want to get into is, the practical application of a lot of this. And as Mike talked about in his message is, when we have these God-sized problems dropped in our lap,
Yeah.
and we have that either-or condition of either I'm supposed to sit back and wait for God to fix this, or it's all up to me, I guess, and I don't know what God's doing, but it's apparently not this. How do we shift this focus to now viewing things through a lens of with?
Well, see, even when you said that, right, we're using terms that belie a thought process.
Yes.
When we use the term God-sized problems, I think all of us immediately think of something really, really massive we can't do.
Yep.
But when we think of the term with, every problem is a God-sized problem.
Yes.
Because he wants, no matter the size, to be working with us.
Yep.
The size of the problem does not make God's interest bigger or less.
Yeah.
Right? And even in our language, when we say that, because immediately, I don't know anyone who doesn't think God-sized problem and doesn't think huge scenario, right? This is what we typically think. Because, again, that shows our thought process of we naturally think it's an either or.
Yep.
Either it's small enough that I can handle it, or it's so big God has to handle it, but it's not a with.
Yeah.
So it just struck me. Just thought I would say that.
Yeah. If this would have been the feeding of the 10, I feel like the disciples probably would have been like, all right, Jesus, you told us to feed them. We can manage this.
But he still, even if it was 10, that's a great point. If it was 10, he still wanted with. He still wanted with.
Yeah.
So.
And so, one of the places we wanted to start was when it feels like there's the problem, we're often very quick to turn to God.
Yep.
And so Mike posed the question of, how do we make sure that we're not just focusing on what God's doing or not doing, but actually focus on this concept of with, of connection with God. And so one of the things that I've found really helpful is when things are really good, breaking glass in case of emergency and connecting with God right then.
Yes.
And not waiting for things to be really bad and breaking glass in case of emergency and connecting with God.
Right.
Only then.
Yeah, well, there's something, we were talking about this a little bit earlier on. I think there's something really unique about our relationship with God that doesn't apply in any other scenario. We have this tendency, I can't speak for everyone, but I think I'm a normal human being when it comes to this. And by the way, that's what Pastor Chris said 2 Sundays ago. We didn't have a chance to talk about it in the last podcast, when he talked about that the ups and downs of the Christian life is actually normative. In fact, the name Israel means struggle with God. Right. He named his people after the struggle. So if you find yourself struggling in this moment, that probably makes you much more normative.
Yep.
Right? But in this moment, if we're good in a relationship with our spouses, right? And if you happen to be married, you get this. If you want to be married, you'll get this. If you're dating someone and you don't get this, you maybe shouldn't be dating them, but that's for a different time. The better the relationship, the more likely we are to pay attention to them. The better it's going, right? The more good is happening, the more I'm spending time with my spouse. And a lot of that is because she's right there with me. I can physically see her all the time. Jesus is right here with me, but that tension of seeing him in the way that we need to see him is not quite the same as, my wife standing there or your wife, Brooke, standing there in front of you. So that it's the only relationship that I can think of that we have this tendency is that when life gets better, we tend to spend less time with that person. Yeah. It tends to not be true in any real interpersonal relationship in that way.
Yeah. And so just take a moment there and just process that.
Yeah.
Because I am profoundly guilty of that. Of when things are good, God is often quite far from my mind. Or there may be God, thanks for making this really good. And then I'm just going to go embrace how good things are and not really continue to engage with God in whatever the good thing is. So, it's a prayer of thanks, and then I can handle the good. God, I don't need you for the good, right? And again, that either or mentality, there's a really good invitation if things are good right now, right? If we are people that are invited into a messy relationship with God because there's things we don't understand and there's timing that we don't get and God's ways are just not our ways, if things are really good right now, take advantage. And if Mike Haynes was here, he'd probably say something, cute, like go snuggle with God.
Yeah.
And take advantage of this moment where things aren't in crisis and draw closer. And we'll talk in a little bit about how to practically do that, but we're going to do it through some of the lessons we learn when things aren't going good.
Yeah. And one of the things that we have repeated many times in this podcast, so we don't assume you listen to all of them, even though we like it when you do.
We do.
there's something I think we need to repeat that we've said before, is that because there's that tension sometimes of physically reminding ourselves that the 24/7 God is with us, we've given some really practical things to do in our lives. What are some things that you can do to remind yourself of that? Another term we call this is called practicing the presence of God. The presence of God is with us, but how do we practice reminding ourselves over and over again? And so there's some things that you can do. We've talked about, I'll just make it quick, in our own lives, maybe make something on your mirror with a little sticky note on your car or on your mirror at home when you get up in the morning. Remind yourself, God is with you. Set an alarm on your phone. Do something, create something, just sort of this constant reminder of that He's with us. And when we're reminding that, the ability then increases for with in the good times. I think a lot of times I was thinking about what you're saying is we think about the gift. Imagine like when we were teenagers, if we were fortunate enough to get a vehicle from a family member that worked, right? And it was great and that sort of stuff.
Caveat,
right? That worked and it was good. So imagine you get this really nice car, but then you don't ever invite that person to ride with you anywhere. Right? We would never do that, right? Because we would constantly be thinking about the gift and those sort of things. And one of the things that Mike brought out in his talk was that if we receive the gift but neglect the giver, right, we've missed the goal, right? If we receive the car but neglect the person that gave it, there's something we're fundamentally missing. And I think that's one of the things why he didn't really talk a whole lot about this, how the actual feeding occurred and that sort of thing, because as Mike brought up, I think there's some points there, but I think for most of us, we're missing the major point of what's going on in the life of the disciples. We see what happens in the life of the people who get the food, but don't necessarily focus on the transformative process Jesus was trying to do there. And that is this idea of not just receiving the gift and neglecting the God who gave it to us, Jesus, but actually understanding the gift, and I want to do it with you.
And there's so many opportunities to engage in that in the midst of your day. Like you talked about, something on the mirror, timer on your phone, calendar reminders if you're a Google Calendar type of person or Outlook or whatever, just things that'll pop up throughout the day and redirect your attention back to God is right here with me. And I want to engage for a moment or two.
I had a friend of mine that gave us an example of prayer points, right? And so that just meant, hey, when you see something, attach that symbol to that and pray for them. If I pass a Dollar General, I pray for my mom because she loves herself some Dollar General, right? If I pass an Elvis picture, I'm probably going to now think, based on what he said, I'm thinking you're right. Maybe pray for Brooke, right? And there's things that do that. You can do the same thing to remind yourself to connect that relationship with God.
Exactly.
Create some symbols. Create those sort of things. That hey, these are these triggers. These are these triggers. There's nothing sacrilegious about doing that any more than it would be something. If we care about someone we're in a relationship with, we want to create these moments that we engage in. It's the same thing.
And I want to parse something that you just said. Because again, I know how I sometimes and how other people sometimes have a tendency to hear things in just a slightly different way. You were talking about seeing a Dollar General, praying for your mom, seeing Elvis. I don't know how often you're going to run into him, but if you do, say hi. And praying for my wife. When we're talking about taking opportunities to connect with God, we're not talking about necessarily opportunities to connect with God on behalf of someone else.
Yes, that's a great point.
So yes, do those things, right? Pray for your spouse, pray for your mother, pray for, but also set aside time where you just connect with God. And it's not about doing anything. It's not about praying for someone or something. It's just taking moments and going, God, I know you're here with me.
Yeah, and that's a great clarification because, there are times that I think that we speak something and we know what we're trying to say, but we miss that. My point in that was exactly what you're trying to bring. What if just like we create this moment, Dollar General reminds you to pray for God, what if I also create some symbols that reminds me to connect with God, just me? Nothing on there. I have that because, it's interesting how I remember my mom more when I see a Dollar General. It just is. It's interesting more when I see a flag. I think of my father-in-law who's a veteran. What can I do also in my life and engage in those ways to, again, I'm not praying for my father-in-law, who I'm sure needs prayer. I'm not praying for my mom who, because I'm her son, I know she needs prayer. I'm like, let's just connect in this way. So good thoughts.
So we know it's switching topics. We know it's so much easier, though, to connect with God in moments when there's challenge, when there's difficulty, when it feels like God's dropped the, hey, there's 10,000 people, go feed them moments.
Right, because the challenge is the representative Dollar General in that case. The challenge is that thing like, boom, this brings it to the forefront.
Right. I am painfully aware of my need for God right now.
Yes.
And one of the things that I've been guilty of, and I know this is true for many people, is in those moments we ask probably very similar questions that the disciples were at least internalizing in that moment of, why is this happening? Mm-hmm. Why me? Why would you do this to me? Right? There's an emphasis on why, because we're not understanding, and as human beings, we so often crave understanding as the foundation of our security in an unstable world. And that is so not the invitation to connect with God. And so things that I've found helpful is to stop asking why questions first. I'm not saying never ask them, because I found God is very willing to answer the why questions, but I've also found that in my frustration and in my desire for control in my life and the world around me, I will go to why first in an accusatory way, almost like Job does with God.
Yeah. Implication, not information.
Exactly. And there are just some questions that I've found to be way more helpful in shifting my focus not only back to God, but back to who I know God really is, rather than the God that I think I'm interacting with in this moment of tension.
And I want to build on this for the people who are listening, right? Because it's something really, really practical, especially when it comes to God. When we lead with the why, I'm just going to be honest in my life, and as I've dealt with people who've sat in my office, have a chance to counsel with, if you prayed with and counseled with, rarely does, if God answers the why, do we not then follow up with another why question?
Absolutely.
So God, why did you do this? And he says, this is why I did it. Our next question is, well, why did you do it that way?
We go full on 5-year-old.
Right. It is why? Because the purpose, whether we realize it or not, is we think that if we could agree with God's methodology, our heart's going to be aligned.
Yep.
Right. But again, as you mentioned, we don't see the way he sees. Yeah. We don't have the wisdom that he has. And so what we're often trying to do in those moments through our why questions, whether we recognize it or not, is bring God down to our levels, right? And God is immanent. He's there with us. But when he comes with us and he's right with us, bring us down to his level doesn't mean, hey, I'm going to now give you all the answer to your why questions. But the fact that, again, because I'm down to your level, you have my presence.
Yes.
You have my presence. So back to what's the better questions to ask?
Right. So instead of why is this happening, questions like, God, what are you up to in the midst of this? Which can still be a little accusatory.
Sure.
But it's at least now, there's a path forward, right? Because if we're in the midst of tension and turmoil, and I've had countless moments like this where things, as we're renovating the house, didn't work out, things as we're still waiting to have children didn't work out, financial crises, health crises, like whatever.
Yeah.
God, what are you up to in the midst of this? Is a heart level question instead of a head level question. It's an invitation for God to show me the piece that I can understand, because I'm not going to grasp the big picture, and he's probably not going to give me the big picture. But I can hang on to this of, God, what are you doing in the midst of this?
Yeah. I'd like to really add something. You mentioned something about, when tone almost has kind of heard like, God, what are you up to? Versus God, what are you up to? Right? Any of us who've ever been on the other end of a question, that how it's presented. But I do want to say this. I grew up in an environment that just said you can't ask God any questions.
Sure.
And so what happened is that I never verbalized some of these things that God already knew in my heart. So while we want to approach God with a God, what are you up to? It's better to approach God with, God, what are you up to? Than not approach him at all. Right? Because that's still the width. That's still giving him that opportunity. And I want us to understand that sort of tension, that when we begin to verbalize those questions, the verbalization of those questions are not for God's benefit, they're for ours. He already knows. He already knows. So that is the beginning of the width. Even if we don't necessarily execute that question well, it's more, God, the implication is, what are you up to? I don't see it, so you can't have a plan. Instead of a gracious way of just information, it's at least a start. So I don't want people to think, I can't get to that point where I'm asking you graciously, so I'm not going to ask it. Just ask it.
God can handle your emotions. No problem whatsoever. And again, things that are invitational that God is aware of, but sometimes we're not even aware of, are questions like, God, what am I believing about you in the midst of this? And it's down there somewhere, right? As we think in our heart, so are we. But we're often not very present in our heart. Oftentimes we spend a lot of time up here. And yet this is what's directing the thoughts up here. And so there's so many moments of tension where I want to come at God with something accusatory. And what's driving it is what I'm believing about God in that moment. Something like he's hanging me out to dry, or he expects me to do this on my own,
right?
Or something like that, that if I ever stopped and paused and reflected on what I know of the God of the Bible and the God of my life, categorically not true. But in the moment, that's what's informing my thinking.
Yeah, I want to peel that back a little bit more because you talked about, here's some things that I'm believing, but even sort of behind that. So I want to illustrate it like in my own personal life.
Yeah.
So we talk a lot about on this podcast, we talk a lot about at Christian Fellowship Church, that at the root of living the life that God has called us to live is really kind of understanding our identity that comes from what Jesus has done for us, right? We are the sons and the daughters of God if we accept the gift of salvation that Jesus Christ provides for us, right? That is our identity. We're no longer sinners. We are sons and daughters. Now, we might still sin, but our identity is different. So one of the things that I believe about God, that I know that I have to dig back to more than I need to, is that when I say, God, you're hanging me out to dry, let's use that for example, that my relationship with God is much more indicative of a foster child with a foster parent. So we use a term called sort of like an orphan heart. And that is, so here's someone who doesn't have parents around them. And so that heart, the way the seat of their emotions really interacts with this foster parent this way. If I don't do everything right, or whatever it may be, you're going to kick me to the curb. You're no longer going to have me a part of your house. You're no longer that. And a lot of times I have this sort of thought that is how God functions with me, that he's punishing me sometimes, even whether I verbalize it or not. What am I believing about you? That maybe you're more of a foster parent than you are an adoptive father. You are more, punitive than you are loving through that. So even when we ask, what are you believing about God? I love that point you brought, that God, you're hanging me out to dry. But for some of us, we need to even think even farther back. How could I ever come to that conclusion that I think God would hang me out to dry? And so, as you're thinking, and we're trying to take this faith forward, one of the things that we try to do in this podcast is to really get at what God wants to transform in us. And a good analogy is this, is that right now we're still in the middle of a COVID pandemic, right? But unless you take a test, you may not know that the fever that you have is COVID or something else, right? And so if it's COVID, but I address that fever, not trying to deal with COVID, what I'm dealing with the symptoms and not the correct illness. When we say, and I say for myself, God, I feel like you're hanging me out to dry, a lot of times that's the symptom exposing this. And so I'm not trying to be overly heady in this, but I think for a lot of us, one of the struggles of why we can't move our faith forward is we really don't believe deep at our core about our identity, right? And since we don't believe our identity, that we are the sons and the daughters of God, how in the world can we think that he wants to do something with us? Why would he want to do something with us if we struggle with that? And so I don't know, I kind of took in a little bit different direction of that, but it reminded me so much in my own life, still over and over and over again. And again, if you've ever tuned into this podcast because you think that John and I, because we work at a church, have it all together, you're going to be sorely disappointed. But here's the thing, we do know who does, and that's part of this process of moving more towards being with Jesus in our life.
Yeah, I think it was G.K. Chesterton, or maybe it was George MacDonald. I think it was Chesterton that said it would have been better for us to have never learned the Father at all than to have learned him wrong.
That is brilliant.
And we've all learned the Father wrong, whether through what we've learned about Father because of people on earth or because of institutions on earth or church upbringing or what. I mean, I talked a few weeks ago on this platform about coming to the realization that one of the things that I believed at a heart level about God was that he was first and foremost disappointed in me and only then was loving.
Yeah.
And the way that I had to work through some of that was God kind of brought to mind something that I barely remembered from, when I was like 7, 8, 9 years old. And I grew up going to the Lutheran church and the Catholic church with my family. And I love the liturgy and I love the ritual and I love the tradition. I miss the stained glass windows. I mean, I wish we could get some in here. Those are just...
We're working on it out in the lobby.
Yeah.
Eventually.
That does something cool for me.
Yeah.
And there's all the prayers that you memorize and you all say in unison. And there was one that I was realizing I had memorized as a kid and internalized without ever understanding the broader implication. But it was basically and it's a section of, I think it's the Augsburg Confession of, like, basically, God, I confess that I've let you down. Right? I confess that I have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed by what I have done and what I have left undone. I have not loved you with my whole heart. I have not loved my neighbor as myself. Yada, yada, yada. Right? And it goes on for a little bit. And all of those things are true. Right? 100% true. I'm not arguing it at all. But I think what I had internalized by learning, because I had a good memory, I picked those things up quick, was I was reciting that Sunday after Sunday, and yet hadn't grasped or experienced the reality of God's love for me. And so here I am weekly confessing how much I'm letting God down without ever experiencing his love.
So I want to pause there.
Yeah.
And I want people, if they're super logical like me, and I'm sorry if you are, I want you to understand exactly what Jon just did here. What Jon did was delineate for you the difference between a descriptive statement and an identity statement. We do let God down. That is a description of our actions. We are not people by identity who are failures to God.
Yes.
Right? We fail, but we're not failures. That's not how God views us. And I think one of the great tools of the enemy is to take even good things like, hey, I let God down.
Yep.
To then turn into an identity statement, I'm a letdown to God.
Yep.
That's not at all true.
Yep.
But making that turn is really, really easy.
Yep.
It's kind of like, we used to be sinners. Now we're sons that sin. There's a difference. I still sin, but my identity is not sinner.
Yeah.
My identity is different. I'm no longer an enemy to God. I am reconciled to God in that way. And so you're bringing this really down. We're thinking about, what we were asking the right question instead of asking why. God, what are you up in the midst of this? We talked about that. What am I believing about you in the midst of this? We talked about that. But we just really gone into that third question on our own. What am I believing about myself in the midst of this? Right? And those are unbelievably intrinsically connected.
They are.
If I have a wrong view about one or the other, about what I believe about God and what I believe about myself, they will always wind up in creating, at least in my life, I'll say for my life, identity statements from descriptions.
Yeah.
Right? And if you don't understand what that is, let me give you a really, really bad test to run. If you're married, go up to your spouse and tell them, you're nagging me. And then watch them hear you say that you're a nag. Mm-hmm. Right? That's what they're going to hear, right? And they should. Don't say that, right? But that's a difference. Technically saying you're nagging me is a descriptive statement, but it's not assigning you an identity that you're a nag, right?
Right.
But how easy it is to do that, right? And don't test that. I was just joking in that. Don't test that.
Don't.
But that's we're trying to give you practical tools.
Yep.
You're like, if that can happen in your life there, that lie and how easy it transitions, how much more when we know we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We wrestle against our own sin, and we wrestle against the enemy that comes at us a lot of times to try to make us get confused about those things. So I guess, the question then we're driving to then, instead of asking God, why is this happening, what Mike was doing over and over again, if it's about inviting the with, how can we get closer in the midst of these moments, good and bad, I guess, in there, to the with?
Right. And so one of the ways is just ask that question.
Yeah.
That exact question, ask it, whether it's a good moment or a bad moment. God, how can I get closer to you in the midst of this? And again, that's so much easier as a starting point when things are tough, right? It just is, because we're more naturally inclined to turn towards God, probably in accusatory fashion, but we're going to get better at that. Mm-hmm. But man, ask those questions when things are good. Yeah.
I mean, what if we actually, when things were good, we went through roughly a lot of the same questions we do with negative. I've said this before on this platform, when we say, we tell people to meditate on scripture, like, I don't know what that means. And I say, well, if you can worry, you can meditate. It's just the same thought process on the good.
Yep.
It's the same thing, really practical, taking your faith forward. All of us know exactly what the process is. Pretty good, I imagine, when things start getting very challenging, right? How we approach, God, what are you up to in this moment? What if we said, God, this has been a great moment. God, what are you up to in this moment?
Exactly.
What are you up to in this moment? And it can be transformative. It should be transformative. Because again, that's this whole thing, right? I mean, Jesus said to them, you feed them, knowing that the goal was not possible without him.
Right.
And in the same way, if the goal is spiritual transformation, if it's to be more like Jesus, it is not possible without him. He's inviting us in, not to be independent, but more God-dependent in that way.
Yeah. And just recognize, too, just how often God is up to something or several things more than we realize. Mm-hmm. That, even with the feeding of the 5 to 10 to 15 to 20,000, the goal was not just the successful execution of dinner.
Yeah.
Right? It was invitation for all of those people to connect. It was an invitation for the disciples to see God more clearly. It was an invitation for the disciples to see that they actually get to do things with God.
Yeah.
Right? And so, as COVID, as COVID restrictions are shifting, right? Maybe you finally get to take that vacation. And so, yes, take the vacation, let out that giant exhale as you leave the house and you park on the beach, the mountains, the lake, the Grand Canyon, wherever. But take a moment and ask that question, God, what are you up to in the midst of this? Because I will guarantee you, 100% money back guarantee, God is up to something more than just, and I don't say just to minimize the rest or the family adventure but I guarantee you that he's got at least 2 or 3 or 4, if not 6, 7, 12, 32 things that he's after in the midst of this good moment.
Yeah.
You win the lottery. Fantastic. God, what are you up to in the midst of this moment? And by the way, notice how for some of you, your heart just went to, he's going to want me to give it all away, isn't it? Right? Heart level understanding of God needs to be addressed. We all have it. Right? But God, what are you up to in the midst of this? What am I believing about you? What am I believing about myself? I'm going to blow this vacation, or I never want to go back because work's a train wreck, or home is difficult, or right? What am I believing about myself? And God, how can I get closer to you in the midst of this? Because that question is so much easier to ask when things are good and you're relaxing on the beach and it feels like God is just right there next to you in the sand. He's got an umbrella in his drink. You've got one in yours. And you're just getting to have a casual conversation because the roof isn't on fire.
Yeah. Some good stuff. I love how these 2 weeks work together. Chris's focus 2 weeks ago, was really a lot on the people who received the bread on the other side, seeing Jesus as their constant source. This week is really a lot on the disciples, which we really do focus a little bit less on that.
We do.
And seeing Jesus as the one who wants to do with. He is your power. He is your source. He is the I am that is with us all the time, 24/7.
Yeah. So as always, thanks for being a part of this. If you have questions, if there's confusion, if you just like to email and want to chat, hit us up. faithforward@cfcwire.org. I have to look down to read that every single time.
I was just thinking too, we should probably tell them up front too. Maybe when we open up and next time we'll say, hey, if you want to, as you're hearing this, maybe send us an email. So
I'm just going to get like a little banner and I'm going to set it, right there.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good call.
That'll just make life easier.
Yeah, we get that up and we get the thing up eventually back here too.
One of these days.
But until then, right?
Until then, thanks for being a part of this and we'll see you next time.